Ah, fuck.
Yo ho, all hands, hoist the colors high. Heave ho, thieves and beggars, never shall we die.
Ladies, gents, and everybody in between, welcome back to the Battle of the Atlantic. Quite a few things have changed gameplay-wise since part 1, let us get straight into it. So, a little while after I posted part 1, Yort, one of the developers of the Battle of the Atlantic mod, offered me access to the 1.1 version. This version of the mod is currently work in progress and isn't available for widespread release, so I think of my playthrough of this mod as a little showcase for the features that are being worked on. There's quite a few things being introduced, and many of them are very nifty, especially in comparison to the base unmodded game. With that out of the way, we load the save and enter the strategic...
Hang on a fucking second, Arctic. It was day 7 at the end of part 1. Why are you starting part 2 on day 9?
Excellent question. So, fun little naval history tidbit for you. Last video, the carrier HMS Furious almost got slapped out of the water by the German battleship Naval. During the Second World War, something fairly similar happened to another British carrier. Even more uncannily, this carrier is the HMS Glorious, one of Furious's two sister ships. In June 1940, amidst the final days of the Norwegian campaign, the battleships Skarnorst and Gneisenau happened upon Glorious while she was heading for Scapa Flow. In the engagement that followed, Glorious, along with the escorting destroyers Ardent and Acasta, were all sunk by the two battleships. Although with that said, Acasta did score a torpedo hit on Skarnorst in an action that added to the many such cases to the stereotype of destroyer crews being composed entirely of damned souls from insane asylums. History shitposting aside, you're right, I'm starting part 2 on day 9. Why is that? The short answer is that I'm a fucking idiot who should never be trusted with even the most simple of tasks. The long answer? So, almost immediately after uploading part 1, I started recording gameplay for this video. I had just started day 9 when Yor offered me access to the unreleased version of the mod. Thinking that the new update might brick my save, I preemptively deleted the footage I had already recorded in anticipation of having to restart the campaign. As it turned out, the new version did not in fact break my existing save file, which meant that I deleted those first 2 days for absolutely no reason. Okay, so we've established that I'm an S-tier moron, but what actually happened in those 2 days? Well, not much. As can be seen in the enemy losses tab in the F5 menu, on July 18th, which is day 8 in game, a single U-boat was sunk. Edinburgh and the escorting destroyers had been returned to Reykjavik after picking up troops when they were bounced by a wolfpack of 3 U-boats en route. One of the destroyers sunk a U-boat using depth charges, but the other 2 escaped. Fortunately, none of my ships were damaged during the engagement. Then, on July 19th, which is day 9 in-game, 2 German merchant ships had been sunk. These 2 ships were part of a convoy in the English Channel ferrying supplies to the French port Brest, and were sunk via air attack, a combination of strafing runs and level bombing attacks via Hurricanes, Fulmars, and Blenheims from the airfields at Plymouth and Southampton. Aside from that, I also had a few encounters with roaming surface groups, but nothing really came of those encounters. A few attempted bombing raids, but these either missed or did no damage. Right, with all that out of the way, what's the battle situation? Since day 7, the various task forces have been moving around. Convoy Australia almost away to Reykjavik, Triton already having arrived at Reykjavik, and Task Force Furious taking the scenic route back to Liverpool. Now, why not take the Northern Channel route back into Liverpool? Let's zoom in on the English Channel. 2 German convoys are visible on the map. The convoy on the left will drop its cargo off at Brest and return to its home port before I can do anything about it, but the second convoy further up the channel still has a long way to go. Furious, with the 10 remaining swordfish, is aiming to get into strike range of the convoy by the following day. But the following day is a while away, and in the meantime, bomber time! FW200's heading... I have no idea where they were going, but Spitfires and Farmers conducted a timely intercept. Bam bam, bam bam, bam bam. A successful intercept. As the day carried on, the notifications of fighters being picked up over France occurred over and over and over again, but nothing of any interest came, and by 0500 the following day, Furious was in position. A small mishap involving the time between aircraft recovery and aircraft launches meant that there was a slight delay in sending out strike, but soon enough the Swordfish were on their way, covered by Hurricane stationed at Plymouth. Entering tactical mode, a single surface contact was reported, a U-boat. Initially, I was really confused, because the contact on the strategic map was definitely that of a convoy, but thinking that the game must have been wigging out, I sent the Hurricanes and Swordfish in for a gun attack on the surface U-boat. The Hurricanes dived down to the deck when I noticed a black artifact in the distance, followed shortly by the reports of a new contact heading in an entirely different direction. Clicking over, I quickly discovered that I had run into one of the new planned features. So, for context, in base game War on the Sea, only one surface task force from each side can be present in tactical mode at any given time. In this situation, that means you would only encounter the U-boats or the convoy, one or the other. But, one of the new features of the upcoming update adds the ability for multiple task forces to appear in tactical mode at once, which is how I've encountered both forces just now. With that out of the way, once I realised the convoy was in fact there, the Swordfish were unevenly divided into 3 flights, while the Hurricanes turned around to engage a second U-boat that had been detected. Unfortunately, despite having 12 guns apiece, the 303 rounds the Hurricanes fired were not particularly effective against shipping, and as such they did minimal damage. Turning out, the aircraft attacked the other U-boat, but once again this failed to do any damage. Back with the convoy side of things, the Swordfish were closing in fast. Red and blue flights targeted the 2 biggest ships in the convoy, the 2 oil tankers, while the smaller yellow flight made an attack run on one of the convoy's escorting warships. And in the midst of all this, the Hurricanes made a gun run on a random ship, starting fires aboard. Yellow flight dropped 2 torpedoes, but not scoring any hits on the absolutely tiny corvette. Blue flight were next in, launching 4 torpedoes. Annoyingly, this caused my frames to absolutely tank. AMD drives are absolutely abysmal, and that's all I'll say in the matter. Anyway, red flight was in next. To the side, blue flight's attack scored 3 hits in the tanker, absolutely gutted her. Red flight dropped 4 torpedoes, losing a member as they flew over, but they also scored 3 hits. The second tanker almost immediately started listing starboard as fires broke out aboard. Looking back, and the damage was painfully visible. 3 of the convoy's transports were burning and slowing. One by one, they all sank. First, the tanker would suffered a catastrophic detonation of its cargo. Then the other tanker succumbing to flooding and rolling over. Then, finally, the transport ship burned down and foundered. With the damage done, the absorbing Swordfish returned to the Furious. 20,000 tons of shipping sunk in one strike. But then, aircraft on the horizon. Enemy fighters coming after the Swordfish. Initially, I thought the torpedo bombers were about to get swatted out of the skies, but the fighters kinda just flew overhead and then buggered off back to France. Okay then. German randomness aside, up in Iceland, Convoy Australia had finally arrived. "6,000 troops and 1,000 units of supply properly set the force balance in my favour, and thus the chapter of the German invasion of Reykjavik was soon to come to an end. After offloading supplies, Convoy Australia turned back for North America. Still, things weren't entirely well, because the Germans had launched yet another bomber raid on Scap Flow. 6 Ju-88s. Foremaster scrambled to intercept.
Hang on, those slow fuckers, they couldn't catch up with the bombers last time!
Yes, you're right. However, this is where more new features come in. In base game War on the Sea, all aircraft have a static top speed. This speed is not affected by manoeuvring, by climbing, by diving, or by the bomb load an aircraft might be carrying at any given time. The new update revamps this whole dynamic, making it so that aircraft lose speed or gain speed depending on if they're diving, climbing, and overall just making aircraft slower if they're packed to the gills with bombs. All of that to say, with the aviation energy dynamics changed, the FOMAs can now perform proper interceptors on bombers. It took a little while since FOMAs are still slow as fuck, but eventually all 6 bombers were shot down and the FOMAs returned to base. This turned out to be a mistake because almost immediately after landing, a second group of bombers was picked up, and this time there were no fighters available to scramble. Oh well, can't win them all. Back with the carrier group, Furious resupplied her air group at Liverpool, bringing her air complement back up to full strength. While the group was still in port, and following the two back-to-back bomber raids, an intrusive thought came to mind. What if I could eliminate the bomb threat entirely? Raids on Scapa Flow were being continuously launched from Bergen, a level 5 airfield in occupied Norway. There are three methods to directly attacking a base. The first is directly invading it, see Reykjavik as an example. The second is via bombing attacks, which is what the Germans have been doing to us. And the third is direct shore bombardment. Now, mechanically in War on the Sea, shore bombardment can be conducted by heavy cruisers, battle cruisers, or battleships. And while I like battle cruisers or battleships, I do have a heavy cruiser available. At Liverpool, the carrier group picked up troops and supplies before making a heading for Scapa Flow. The plan was to drop these troops off at Scapa Flow before approaching Bergen overnight to avoid the risk of air attack. Norfolk would then bombard Bergen before the carrier group hightailed it back for Britain. At the same time, a second plan came to hatch. So far, every time ships have needed resupply, they had to go to any port with supplies, fuel, and engineering. But there exists yet another mechanic in the existing mod, i.e. this can be done in the public release of the mod, that allows ships to resupply from other ships at sea. This is a method known as RAS, or replenishment at sea, and in the modded game it requires a group of ships to be within close range of a force of tankers and cargo ships carrying supplies, fuel, and engineering. The advantages of this method is that it allows ships to operate away from home ports for longer periods without having to commit to lengthy travel times back and forth to resupply. Given the sheer scale of the Atlantic, this was a very promising concept, and as such, I went through the process of collecting ships for a mobile resupply force. There was only one problem. After scouring through the recognition manual to see what was available, I realised that all of the ships were going to have to come from North America, which meant a 2-week transit period until the replenishment force was available for tasking. This was a mildly disappointing realisation, but it was something I could live with. As such, a new task force was created, designated Resup 1, and equipped with 5 ships. The small Dutch steam merchants Breda and Jan Mayen, the Dutch cargo ship MV Zaanland, and the Dutch tanker Ajax. Escorting the transports was a single warship, the destroyer HMS Vanity. Picking up supplies from Halifax, Resup 1 set course for Reykjavik, where it was planned for them to meet up with the carrier group. By 0500 the following day, 2 convoys were picked up. Or at least I inferred they were convoys, because apparently one of them had a carrier in their midst, which was a very bold claim by the strategic map, especially because Germany doesn't have any carriers. Just to make sure that I hadn't missed a new addition to the German roster, I looked at the recognition manual and sorted by the various carrier types. CVS, anti-submarine carrier, nothing. CVL, light aircraft carrier, nada. CVE, escort carrier, zilch. And CV, fleet carrier, empty. Now, Germany did have plans to construct aircraft carriers. The most well known was the Graf Zeppelin, but there was also a second carrier of the Graf Zeppelin type under construction, plus plans to convert the Hipper-class heavy cruiser Seydlitz into a light carrier. However, owing to wartime pressures, none of these ships ever entered service with the Kriegsmarine. History tidbit aside, Hurricanes were dispatched to investigate this convoy that apparently had a carrier. Sure enough, it was just a convoy of transports plus a couple of escorts. The Hurricanes launched a gun run on one of the transports, but this caused minimal damage. Moments later, they attacked one of the convoy's escorts. This caused an explosion and started a fire, but after observing for a little bit, the fire was put out with much distress. Elsewhere, outside of Grimsby, another bomber raid had been launched. Once again, Spitfires and Hurricanes intercepted the bombers. And I'm gonna be honest, I flipped the game over to the map mode while getting up to go do something, letting the intercept resolve itself. I came back after a while, and sure enough, all bombers had been intercepted. Up to the northwest, Furious was approaching Scapa Flow when an enemy scout plane was spotted by a patrolling aircraft out of Scapa Flow. This far out to sea, the only place a scout plane could have come from was an enemy surface force with some kind of large ship. Further patrols were sent out to investigate, making contact soon thereafter. Since Furious was in the area, she was redirected northwards to get in range for an airstrike. I was in the middle of setting up for this when... Wait a second, Triton is at Reykjavik? Oh no! Sure enough, it was an invasion force, and this time the Germans had brought honest-to-God troop transports. However, this was the exact possibility that Triton had been sent to Reykjavik for to counter. Unfortunately, I was about to commit the absolute worst blunder in Submarine history. Entering tactical mode, Triton was well outside of torpedo range. However, she was also outside of spotting range, and unlike her encounter with Admiral Hifford the previous week, she could outrun the convoy on the surface. As such, Triton surfaced and moved that all-ahead flank to get in a position for a torpedo attack. This was going well, until at just past 13,000 yards, a shell landed right next to the sub. The convoy dispersed, and escorting destroyers turned towards Triton. She had been spotted on her approach path. Now, on its own, this wasn't too bad, since my operating principle was that Triton could torpedo the destroyers as they got close, and once the escorts were dispatched, she could easily chase down the merchants on the surface. Sure enough, the destroyers approached. A large Type 1934A got to within 3,000 yards. Torpedo away! The long-range hull-poking device got close, but it just barely missed, skimming over the destroyer's bow. Fair enough, so another torpedo went downrange. Torpedo away. This angry underwater pipe bomb also missed. This was starting to become a problem, but surely third time's the charm, right? Torpedo away, and this one also missed. The destroyer was now within 1,000 yards and almost certainly lining up for a depth charge run, so Triton fired a narrow spread of 2 torpedoes. At this rate, I attempted to manually fire a torpedo, but the destroyer was now too close, so Triton was forced under to evade, diving deep and hugging the seabed as the destroyer rolled overhead, hull looming menacingly above. No depth charges came, but I had lost sonar contacts on the first destroyer, and as such, Triton now had to get out of the way of a second destroyer. Once again, no depth charge barrage, but now both destroyers were behind Triton. The submarine came to periscope depth and raised the scope so that I could get a map bearing on the 2 destroyers before firing a spread of 3 torpedoes into the submarine's stern tubes. Unfortunately, because I was using manual fire like a dingus, all 3 missed. By this point I was getting desperate, and as such 2 more torpedoes from the bow followed. Unsurprisingly, these missed their intended target. Surprisingly, however, one of the 2 did slam the lead destroyer right amidships, crippling her. It was a stroke of good luck, but it wasn't one I could capitalise on, because another salvo of 3 torpedoes also missed the undamaged destroyer. I was at my wit's end by this point, and Triton was running low on torpedoes. Frustrated, and after some brief evasion, Triton left the combat area and headed deeper into the bay to try to get ahead of the convoy again. This time I had been handed the easiest setup for a convoy attack. Triton was right on the convoy's direction of travel, 10,000 yards ahead. It was just as easy as laying in place and waiting for the transports to get within torpedo range. I had time to identify every ship in the convoy by their sound signatures. I had identified the top priority targets in the convoy to hit with my now limited stock of torpedoes. The distance ticked down. 10,000 yards, 5,000 yards, 3,000 yards, and as the closest transport got to within 1,000 yards, torpedoes away. There was only one problem. Torpedoes require a bit of runtime for their internals to spool up and start operating properly, and I was far too close for them to spool up in time. They arched in towards the bow of the transport, and with one little turn, the transport evaded both torpedoes intended for it. Further off in the distance, the large destroyer I targeted had also evaded both torpedoes intended for it. I don't use an open mic when I record my footage, so you don't hear me say anything, but trust me when I say that I was absolutely livid at the outcome. Falling back to the strategic map, there was nothing that Triton could do. She was out of torpedoes, and the warships of Convoy Australia were way too distant to do anything about it either. Australia and Perth were detached from convoy escort duty to head back to Reykjavik to see if anything could be salvaged at the situation, but the damage had already been done. 8,000 Allied troops were now opposed by an equal number of German troops, endlessly lengthening the battle. The pain was increasing. It didn't help that bombing raids were simultaneously launched on both Southampton and Grimsby. I was a little out of it following the submarine blunder, so I was too late to prevent the former from being bombed, but the latter I noticed just in the nick of time. I kinda just let the fighters do their thing while I buggered off to go do something else. When I got back, all 6 bombers had been, unsurprisingly, shot down. Back on the cutting edge of things, a patrolling air group from Furious rediscovered that same German surface group from earlier, and it was a big force. 2 transports and 3 destroyers centered around a light cruiser, the Panzerschiff Lutzow, and a pre-dreadnought battleship.
Whoa! Germany had older ships?
Yes, most people would have heard of Bismarck and Tirpitz, Germany's 2 most famous battleships. Lesser known but still in the public eye are the smaller Skynos and Gneisenau. But then not a lot of people know about the Schlesien and Schleswig-Holstein, a pair of pre-dreadnought battleships that dated back to the very earliest years of the 20th century. Serving through World War I of the Imperial German Navy, the interwar period of the Reichsmarine, and then into World War II of the Kriegsmarine. Both ships supported the German invasion of Poland, and then the following German invasion of Norway, but past that neither ships did much of particular interest, and by 1945, both had been crippled and sunk. Brief history lesson aside, yes, there was now a German raider force north of Scapa Flow. Aircraft cooldowns meant that Furious couldn't launch a strike before nightfall, so the force withdrew to Scapa Flow with the goal of sailing out in the morning to catch a German force by force. In the night, Australia and Perth arrived at Reykjavik, but after a brief patrol found no sign of the convoy they had been detached to stop. With daylight, Furious sent out air patrols looking for the surface force. The force in question was a lot closer than anticipated, within 100 nautical miles of the base. On top of that, they were attempting to close the distance on Scapa Flow. By this point, with the 2 sides converging and with bombers looming overhead, Norfolk, Edinburgh, Cossack and Maori detached from the carrier to intercept the surface force, while Furious and Somali hang back to provide aviation support from the distance. The cruiser said this barely detached when the German ships were still well out of range. This was a U-boat encounter. As soon as all ships entered tactical mode, the retreat order was given and all ships accelerated to flank speed. Lookouts kept an eye out for torpedo contrails, which were fast to approach. 1 spread of 4 straight ahead, then a second spread of 4, one of which was targeting Edinburgh. The light cruiser turned to get between the spread when the torpedo alarm sounded, which was the moment that I realised something. That first spread was targeting Edinburgh's flank, a textbook attack. Luckily, Edinburgh was travelling pretty fast and was able to get out of the way in time to avoid any hits, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't at least partially shit myself during the process. After a bit of fluffing around, including Maori chasing after a U-boat in reverse, for the record, this shouldn't work, but depth charges can't damage their own launch vessels as far as I'm aware, and I really hate U-boats. So, yeah. Anyway, after spending way too many depth charges on one target, the rest of the force withdrew and continued to close with the German surface force. Approaching the combat range, Furious launched a swordfish squadron to shatter the Germans, while the cruisers and destroyers closed the distance. Eventually, the enemy was on the horizon, 30,000 yards away and closing. Now, the battle plan here was pretty simple. The Swordfish would make an attack on the pre-dreadnought, as it was the most well-armoured ship in the enemy's force, while Norfolk and Edinburgh would focus Lutzow and then the Nürnberg. All the while, Cossack and Maori would focus on the destroyers and transports. Overhead, the 15 Swordfish present was split into 2 groups of 7, plus a single lone bomber that I was going to manually control. Both sides exchanged fire. Norfolk and Edinburgh with their 8-inch and 6-inch main gun batteries respectively, the pre-dreadnought and Lutzow with their 11-inch main guns. Mary observed shells bracketing Edinburgh, and overhead the swordfish were manoeuvring in position and closing in, setting up for an anvil attack on the pre-dread, but a single swordfish that I was manually controlling was going for the light cruiser. It weaved through dense anti-aircraft fire, past the destroyers screening the main body of the force, lined up for an attack and dropped its torpedo. There was a streak in the water heading for the slow-moving ship. The torpedo was gonna hit. What I wasn't expecting was for the torpedo to set off a magazine detonation that obliterated the front end of the cruiser. Sadly, the offending swordfish was shot down seconds later, but damage had already been done. With a pillar of smoke rising from the light cruiser, the remaining swordfish launched their attacks, bracketing the pre-dread with the torpedoes. The first wave of fire from the west missed by the narrowest of margins, but the eastern attack of another 6 scored 2 hits on the ship's broadside, starting fires and causing some nasty flooding. That wasn't the extent of the damage, however, because right behind the pre-dread was the Lutzow, moving painfully slowly. The Panzer ship attempted to accelerate, but it was far too late. 3 hits in total hit her bow and stern, knocking out Lutzow's forward turret and crippling her propeller shafts, rendering the ship dead in the water. The Swordfish Squadron had been slaughtered. 10 of the 15 aircraft were shot down, but they had completed their mission. It was time for the surface forces to mop up. Norfolk and Edinburgh were closing in fast, while the stricken German capital ships turned tail and attempted to withdraw, even while gunfire from the escorting German destroyers was getting more intense. Mary, the lead Allied destroyer, took a glancing hit with the start of the fire. At this point, the destroyers and cruisers divided into 2 battle lines. The destroyers moved flank while the cruisers continued to advance. In the distance, Lutzow was getting hammered, while both the Pre-Dread and the Nürnberg were heavily on fire and attempting to withdraw. With the rage closing to within 10,000 yards of the German destroyer screen, both Norfolk and Edinburgh started to receive hits from the destroyers. In reply, all ships turned to give broadside to an advanced Type 1936 destroyer. Intense gunfire turned the surrounding sea to foam before the 1936 started getting absolutely hammered by every single gun in the British line. Within a minute, the destroyer was burning intensely and coming to a crawl before sinking in short order. The next ship to draw the ire of the cruiser's guns was another destroyer, a Type 1934A, while Mary and Sack focused their fire on a German transport. Getting absolutely pasted by the broadside weight of the 2 tribal-class destroyers, the transport sunk in short order. They then shifted their fire to the German destroyers, and before long the Type 1934A was straddled, set on fire, and destroyed. Next to go was another Type 1944A, but before any rounds could impact the destroyer, there was a notification of another ship sinking. The Lutzow had been overcome by extensive fires and flooding. Snapping back to the destroyer, I was just in time to see the 1934A get absolutely hammered by a salvo from Mary and Sack. Follow-up shots from Edinburgh and Norfolk lit the destroyer up like a bonfire, and she sank mere moments later. With the escort string comprehensively flattened, the British ships focused their attention on the Nürnberg, fastest remaining ship in the German line. Overhead, the 4 miles that had been scanning ahead of the fleet earlier were directed in to strafe the oiler that was accompanying the enemy. Having already been set on fire by Maori, the 4-mile gun run lit the entire front end of the tanker up. As the 4 miles withdrew, Nürnberg finally rolled over and sank. The tanker joining her on the base at the bottom moments later. With the last of the transports and the smaller escorts destroyed, that left one final target, the single hardest target in the German line, the pre-dreadnought. Murray and Cossack closed in for a torpedo run, while Norfolk and Edinburgh remained at standoff range to bombard the ancient battleship. While none of the fleet's guns, with the exception of Norfolk's main battery, could penetrate her armour, they could set the pre-dread on fire, and before long, the last ship... standing was set ablaze. From a distance, Norfolk launched a salvo of torpedoes and headed to finish off the pre-dreadnought and to save the torpedoes and destroyers. Still, that didn't stop Mary from performing a drive-by of anti-aircraft guns. Seconds later, before the torpedoes impacted, the last ship sank. For the loss of 10 aircraft, 8 German ships have been sunk, including 2 of Germany's very limited stock of capital ships. After all of the frustration of raiding convoys from the air, after the fuck-up of Reykjavik, I had managed to score a comprehensive victory over the Germans, and one that wouldn't soon be forgotten. On a good day, I would have ended this video on a high note right here and then. But week 2 wasn't over just yet, and Furious's group had yet to carry out the objective they set out to fulfill. So, after a bit of a victory lap, the cruisers and destroyers moved the link back up with the Furious. Or at least they attempted to, because it turned out there was a wolf pack in the area. It didn't take long for the U-boats to make themselves known, torpedo salvos being launched from near point-blank range at both Edinburgh and Norfolk. These bow aspect shots all missed, but Norfolk had an extremely close brush with Davy Jones when the torpedo alarm sounded off for a third time. Remember how Edinburgh had a close encounter with torpedo attacks from multiple directions? The exact same situation was occurring to Norfolk, except at much closer range. Turning hard to starboard and into the torpedoes, Norfolk just narrowly avoided being struck. Almost concurrently with this, Maori rushed forward and launched a depth charge attack barrage on the U-boat closest to the force before continuing to a second U-boat to launch another barrage. Cossack followed up Maori's second attack while Maori launched a third attack, expending the last of her depth charges. With both destroyers having launched attacks, the force left the combat area, having damaged 2 U-boats but failing to score any kills. Once Furious linked back up with the cruisers, the task force sailed onwards for Bergen. However, they had hardly left British waters when an air raid showed up, 12 Bf-110 heavy fighters painted dark as sin. In response, Furious launched her 6 Sea Gladiators, but biplanes were both outnumbered and outclassed. A valiant fight broke out, during which 10 of the 12 attackers were shot down by a combination of concentrated anti-aircraft fire and by fighters. But in return, all 6 Gladiators had been shot down, and Furious herself was struck by a Bf-110 that she herself had shot down. Immediately following the encounter, fighters from Grimsby picked up a large bomber force heading north from German-based airfields, 9 Dornier Do-17s. This force was handily dealt with, but it drove home a new lessons. The Germans could and would launch bomber attacks on any detected surface groups if any of the airfields were within range. Speaking of which, almost immediately afterwards, Furious was attacked by bombers, FW-200s from Bergen. With no aircraft capable of fleet air defense, the force's only defenses were the anti-air guns mounted on each ships. This proved to be woefully inadequate, and Furious was hit on the aft flight deck by one bomb, which mercifully did little damage. Following this attack, night fell, which meant that the carrier group could get to Bergen under the cover of darkness and away from enemy aircraft. Arriving just before the start of flight operations at 0500, Norfolk detached to bombard the Norwegian base, several hundred rounds of 8-inch shells hitting the base, to no significant effect. While disappointing, it wasn't entirely unexpected, and so the carrier group withdrew. Daylight was soon to come, and the group was about to run the gauntlet. The fleet's Walrus scout planes were recalled to prevent them from being shot down by Bf-110s, but in the process came the single largest bomber attack I'd seen so far in the campaign. No less than 19 bombers, all targeting Furious. Flight clouds and anti-aircraft tracers lit up the skies, but it wasn't an effective deterrent as the bomber elements made their passes. The first drop scored 2 hits, the second, none. A bomber in the third drop was shot down, but 5 hits were scored in return. The fourth and final run scored 1 hit plus a dud. 8 bomb hits in total. Checking the damage award, it could have been a hell of a lot worse though. Furious's aft magazine had been hit, and there was a small fire, but otherwise the damage was insignificant enough not to have to worry about it. We'd gotten lucky. A bit over an hour later, and another attack came. Furious was bracketed, but luckily no hits were scored this time around. However, very far to the carrier's southeast was another bomber group made up of HE-111Hs. Furious's luck persisted though, because the carrier group was able to leave the combat area before the second wave made it overhead for their attacks. After the second raid, fighters from both Scapaflow and Grimsby were sent out to cover Furious despite operating at the very edges of their operational ranges. In spite of that, as the hours ticked down and the carrier group got further and further away from Bergen, no further attacks came. And as day 14 rolled around with a new stylish noise to indicate the end of the week, the skies were clear. Over the carrier. Over the English Channel though, bombers were on their way heading for Liverpool. They got close, but Spitfires and Hurricanes from Plymouth and Liverpool caught Ju-88s just in time. And for the third time I got up, buggered off and do something else while the fighters did their thing. When I got back, the skies were clear. Another successful intercept. Night fell on day 14 and Furious was home safe. It had been a bit of a close call, that seems to be a recurring theme for the British forces so far. As week 2 drew to a close, many a lesson had been learned, some of them quite painful. In particular, my fuck up with Triton was a harsh lesson in the fact that submarines need to keep their distance from ships to make effective attacks. With that said, remarkably, I managed to put myself in the same circumstances as I was in at the end of week 1. Reykjavik was in even more need of relief, but once again a good number of German warships had been sent to the bottom of the ocean. But even with the loss of a battleship and a Panther ship, the Germans still had a considerable number of ships to throw around, and when those ships came out to play, they weren't going to go down without a fight. This has been the Battle of the Atlantic campaign for War in the Sea. Stay frosty folks, and I'll catch you on the next one.